So in terms of overview, I'll give a brief introduction of the WHO guidelines, the 2018 update, and then we can briefly look at PIs, and then my other colleagues, Michelle and Lloyd, would come in with their respective presentations. And like I said, this is going to be very interactive. And I hope everybody has the keypad on the table. If you don't have a keypad, you raise your hand, and then the J&J team will get you one. Okay. So in terms of the learning objectives, we are looking at, by the end of this session, we need to be able to review the main challenges around long-term management of HIV in adults and pediatric patients in the Africa region. And we should be able to specifically discuss issues related to the long-term use of protease inhibitors. We'd also should be able to describe the latest management around ART and how it affects local clinical management. So we'd have different experiences from different countries. And then also finally to apply the latest clinical data and HIV treatment guidelines to clinical practice in our own countries. And this would involve discussing the optimal strategies available in West Africa and also other parts of Africa. I've already gone through the outline of today's symposium. So with the keypad, we'll have a couple of questions. So you make a selection, and then when you press OK, it registers. Okay? So let's try it. Oops. So the first question, which of the following colors are in the Ghana flag? You select 3 and press OK. Oh, voting is still taking place. Okay. Okay, so there are a few people in this house. I hope there are no Ghanaians in there. Good, so at least the key parts are working. So, so now let's go through the WHO ARV guidelines development, and like most of you know, the guidelines that we have is strongly evidence-based. It looks at publications over time that gives the evidence in terms of the effectiveness of the drugs. It also looks at the costs. Effectiveness is important, but cost is also important because it affects accessibility. And also, whatever you have, it needs to be simple. It needs to be able to be used in different settings. Okay. So, in 2016, we had the guidelines for treat all, and it's almost like 10 years ago, because after 2016, so many things have happened in terms of the guidelines, and it's been changing rapidly. The latest one that we have is the December 2018, and that is also probably going to change very soon. Now, with the 2016 guidelines, the preferred first line was the efavirenz-based regimen with the tenofovir, lamivudine, or emtricitabine. And for the first time, we got the alternate of dolutegravir. And of course, dolutegravir was not the preferred first line because it still needed a lot of information on the product. We also had the mention of TAF, tenofovir alafenamide, but again, there were issues of clinical experience and also potential interaction with rifampicin. Okay. Now, with the technical update and the 2018 guidelines, dolutegravir has actually moved to become the preferred first line because it was demonstrated effectiveness when you compare it to the efavirenz-based regimen. It had a higher viral load suppression, and then a very good CD4 count recovery rates. And then, of course, the potential for drug-drug interaction was much favorable compared to efavirenz. But the big concern, and I think all of you are grappling with that in your programs, had to do with the women in the reproductive age group. So this basically summarizes the first-line regimen they prefer. So if the woman is in the reproductive age group, you would have to look at the issues of contraception. The client has to be adequately informed and then to make a choice. And where dolutegravir cannot be given, the efavirenz-based regimen can be offered. And for the children, we have abacavir, lamivudine, and then dolutegravir. For the younger ones, the neonates, we had the introduction of raltegravir, but this will probably be a discussion for another time. For second line, you'd have to look at where the patient started in terms of the first line regimen. And if the person starts with the dolutegravir, then obviously a protease inhibitor will be the preferred drug for second line. Now, if you take an efavirenz-based regimen, then you would have to move to dolutegravir. And the same principle basically will apply for the children as well. So, I mean, we continue to revise the guidelines based on evidence. And I'm sure as we practice, we have more research studies. All these new findings will be taken into consideration when the new guidelines are released. So the second part of this presentation will look at the understanding the role of protease inhibitors in treatment in Africa. And I'll have a few questions for you on that. Now you can pick your keypads. Oops. Now, oops. Okay, so which guidelines do you most closely follow when prescribing ART? Select one. One of the answers. So it looks like local hospital guidelines. That's giving us 69%. Sorry. National, sorry. So national guidelines is giving us 69%, and then followed by WHO. So clearly, I think your national guidelines actually determines what you do in your practice. Good. Let's move on. Now, when will you consider a Okay. When will you consider a protease inhibitor as part of antiretroviral therapy? Here you can select up to 3. Up to 3. Okay, so basically what we have here is that 3% of you never use protease inhibitors. You have no experience with the use of protease inhibitors. 97% have experience with protease inhibitors. And out of the 97%, 66% use it as second line. 60, okay. I need to change my glasses. Yeah, 60% use it as second line, and then 40% as third line. So it means that we have a good number of you who have experience in management of third line. And then, it's 52% as third line, and then initiating as first line is 40%. So that's a very good spread. And hopefully by the end of this session, we should be able to discuss the use of protease inhibitors in the different lines. Which WHO recommended protease inhibitor do you have available to prescribe? You can select up to 3. So 1% actually have none of the PIs available. So 99% of you have, and of the 99%, 79% use the ritonavir boosted lopinavir. Then number 2 is atazanavir is at 41%, and then darunavir is at 28%. Interesting.
So in South Africa at the moment, currently we follow guidelines that are fairly similar to WHO guidelines. So our main use at the moment for PIs is in patients who've failed first-line antiretroviral therapy. At first-line failure, we don't genotype patients, so we tend to do a cycling of the nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor backbone, much like they do with the WHO guidelines. So obviously, if you've got a TDF based backbone in first line and you fail, we'll generally put a patient onto an AZT backbone. And the PI that we use most commonly is still Eluvia or lopinavir. We do use atazanavir to a certain extent, but we generally use it in patients who either develop dyslipidemia on Eluvia or who have issues around tolerance of Eluvia in terms of gastrointestinal. And the reason we haven't actually used atazanavir earlier in our guidelines at this point is plain and simply for us a lack of co-formulation makes it a challenge. The Eluvia is simply easier in terms of managing stocking within facilities. The other issue is we still have a relatively high incidence of TB in second-line patients, more so than in first-line. And so obviously it's easier for us to be able to use Eluvia and know how to accommodate rifampicin-based TB treatment, which we don't know how to do with atazanavir. The other place that we use protease inhibitors is we use darunavir in our third-line based regimen. Now, we do a genotype at second-line failure, and all of our patients who go onto a third-line regimen get darunavir. The dose that we use is based on what resistance we see to darunavir at second-line failure. So some of our patients on third-line actually get once a day darunavir at 800, and those who have some darunavir resistance-associated mutations get the 600 BD. We also, of course, use protease inhibitors in pediatric patients as well, but I think we're going to address pediatrics a little bit later, so I'll pause it at that point. But so mainly for us, the protease inhibitor we use the most is Eluvia, and that is really around the fact that we know what to do in TB. There's a lot of data around the use of Eluvia, and for us it's co-formulated, which makes it easier.
Okay. Lloyd, what's the experience in Zambia?
Yeah, it's similar to Michelle's experience for first lines, pediatric lopinavir boosted with ritonavir. Then also for second line, we have atazanavir and also lopinavir as well. Then for third line, the darunavir. In terms of the split, majority of our patients are on boosted lopinavir in second line. But also in adolescents, we try and use more of the atazanavir because of the dosing, the frequency. Then in third line, largely it's boosted darunavir, which we're using.
Yes, and for Ghana and most of the West African countries, we find ourselves in a very unique situation because we have HIV too. And in diagnosing your patient, it's important to determine whether your patient has HIV-1 only, HIV-1 and 2, or 2 only. So immediately your patient has HIV-2 or 2 with 1, you would have to give a protease inhibitor because we all know that the non-nucleosides actually do not work with HIV-2. So that's one of the criteria for using a protease inhibitor as a first line. But in terms of second line, I think the practice is like what you find in South Africa and Zambia, where you have lopinavir. That's where we have a lot of experience in terms of the number of years that we have used. And then, of course, more recently, we have atazanavir. We have a couple of patients on third line, but not as many as you find in the advanced treatment center you have in Lusaka. And all the third line patients are on darunavir, ritonavir boosted darunavir. So similar to, and of course the practice is that for patients on third line, you try and do the genotyping to select the appropriate drugs. So that is in terms of practice, and I believe that this reflects what is happening in the Africa region, West Africa, East and then Southern Africa.